All right, Jack, so we're back live. Want to get back into now this Ukrainian corruption story, coupled with the fact that Russia has now launched its spring-summer offensive. This is something that was predicted by none other than Lt.Col.Shaffer here on this very program. And when did Russia launch it? Of course, May 9th, their national day, crossing the border, slamming into the northern province of Kharkiv. And of course, the question then becomes, how is it that Russia was able to come across so quickly, especially at a time when really everybody predicted that there was going to be an offensive? The BBC put out reports saying that the fields were not mined, that the Russians were essentially walking right in. And then Ukrainian Pravda puts out a report from the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Center, which is actually affiliated with like George Soros and a bunch of lefties, was saying that the money that was sent for the defense of Kharkiv province had been funneled away into fictitious companies. The oligarchs were pocketing all of this, and the Russians were able to walk right in. Guess what? You think Russian intelligence didn't know where the fortifications were, didn't know about the money, didn't know what was going on? It's very clear. Here we are on the podcast watching all this. Lt.Col. Tony Shaffer, let's get your take on these latest updates and developments out of Ukraine.
So I think we need to take a step back and remember what we're dealing with here, Jack. You and I are very good about tracking things. And one of the things I said from the beginning, we are dealing with cultures which mirror each other. Two sides of the same coin. I don't care what analogy you want to make, but the corruption in Ukraine is not significantly different than the corruption in Russia. You can't call Putin and his oligarchs corrupt without accepting the fact that we've got the same thing with Zelensky and his crowd. So it's like, okay, they're all corrupt. And then you then decide to pick a side, which again, I think this is a civil war. We picked a side in the civil war, which was stupid. And we've now been funding this other side. And oh, by the way, we who are concerned about the strategy, like why are we doing this? And say, if you're going to fund it, let's account for it. And then our own Congress won't do any oversight, won't actually look at where the money's going, which again, it's like you're fueling the very corruption we now acknowledge exists. And then you get things like, oh yeah, we paid all this money for the construction and retention of barriers to prevent the Russians from invading or moving quickly if they invade. And there's no barriers because all the money is gone to the oligarchs. And we're somehow surprised by this, Jack. Why are we surprised by this? Well, I don't think we are surprised. I think the fact is the Western media continues to ignore what we've said are observable facts that actually impact on the relationship we have with Ukraine. At least it should. And the fact is that there's no strategy, there's no belief that we're actually going to actually stop the Russians. And here we are. And I did say earlier this year in very clear terms, as soon as the Russians were ready, of a time of their choosing, they'll choose to come in and start offensive operations. And we're at that point now.
And so this is the real question that everyone is asking is, with billions on the line, where exactly is the money going? And there's no question that all of us who were saying that Ukraine, this is the reason they weren't allowed in the EU in the first place.
Right.
Even before the Civil War kicked off, even before all this stuff kicked off in 2014, a decade ago, people were saying, and you can go and find the reports from all of the international auditing firms and all this. They said there's too much corruption. There's no way. And Ukraine has always been, and really the Black Sea area, not just Ukraine, but many countries around the Black Sea have always been notorious for the trafficking of weapons, the trafficking of drugs, and unfortunately the trafficking of the human labor trafficking and sex trafficking. This has always been a huge issue in the Black Sea. A lot of countries are fighting it, but we already know that in Ukraine, apparently, that, by the way, you don't even have to take my word for it, because this is what Zelensky campaigned on. Zelensky campaigned on cleaning up corruption. And now you got a guy like this where people are making money by stealing hand and fist. Tony Shaffer.
So yeah, meet the new boss, just like the old boss, as the Who says. I mean, it's all the same, recycled over and over. And the money's gone to three places. First, I'll be blunt. The American industrial base has been greatly benefiting. Eisenhower once warned us of the military-industrial congressional complex. Well, that's where a lot of it goes. And other politicians, to include Jake Sullivan, said, oh, yeah, we're spending a lot of money here in the United States because we make them weapons. So that's number one. Number two, and this is where it gets dicey, is the direct funding of the Ukrainian government, their civil service, their puppet shows in Kiev, the politicians. We are literally throwing money at them like they were a state of the union. This is like us throwing money at Puerto Rico once Puerto Rico had a hurricane. That's what we're doing here. And so that money, I know for a fact, is the issue. And then the third category of money is that which actually goes to defending their nation. That is to say that they depend on us giving a certain amount of liquid assets, a certain amount of cash, which is supposed to go for local use. That is to say, contractors which are contracted by the Ukrainian government to go do things or make things. And that's what we're finding. All that money has been essentially stolen. It's not been used for anything that was supposed to be on the bill of goods that we were supposed to be funding. And I don't know why people are surprised by this. Everybody somehow, geez, this should have been something we looked at. Well, a lot of us did want to look at it. It was the political left who, I would argue, when I mentioned the politicians there, Jack, I think there's some link between U.S. Democrat politicians and those on the ground. And don't I remember? Mr. 10%, Joe Biden may have gotten 10% from Hunter Biden and what they were doing. So I think there's some real issues there that have to be looked at.
Well, and there's no question. But unfortunately, the people who are caught in the middle of all this are number one, the Ukrainian soldiers, and number two, the Ukrainian people that are all caught in the middle. I think we actually have one of the contracts. We can show this up if we have here. And you can see, again, these are the documents that list you, and you can see the leaders' names right next to the names of the companies that were sent over. Many of the same times you see these companies that exist only on paper because they're controlled by, directly linked to the oligarchs that were given the money. So they were told, one is a contract for wood, one was a contract for concrete, one was a contract for, entrenchments and shovels and all this. But Tony, talk to me about the Russian advance that we've actually seen. What do you think Russia's strategy is? Do you think that they intend to actually attempt to take the city of Kharkiv?
Yes, of course. I think it's a matter of time. To your point, you mentioned in the run-up that there were villages you're just kind of walking into. There's been extraordinary gains of land. I mean, in the last 5 days, I think they've gained like 120 kilometers. Now, think about the slugfest they've been in, Jack. They've been fighting for millimeters, meters to millimeters of territory every day. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, everything's open. Well, everything is open because the very thing we're talking about, the oligarchs not having built these fallback positions, these barriers, the Russians are just driving along. So I think the Russians are going to have to assess what do they do. I think they kind of knew this was going on. I mean, the Russians have got really good intel on everything going on there. And I think that the Russians now are going to look at two things. First, what will be the cost of obtaining and controlling more land? Is it worth it to us? Because so far, the Donbass and other regions they've taken control of, there's very little in the way of, most of the populations for them being there. So the other thing that the Western media continues to not report at all is like, there's no people being upset with the Russians being there because they're kind of Russians who are for the Russian occupation. And I wouldn't even call it an occupation. I'd say the Russians wanted the referendum, and that referendum has been kind of done by the fact they've retained the land and everybody's not upset. Secondly, what do the Russians want relating to the territory? And I think they could go all the way to the river. And
we're going to learn that very soon. And I think you're right, Tony. A quick break here. We'll be right back. Lt.Col. Tony Shaffer breaking down the latest developments, the Russian offensive across the northern border of Ukraine, the undefended.